June 13th, 1944. 7 days after the beaches ran red at Normandy. A narrow French lane near Villers-Bocage, barely wide enough for a farm cart, now choked with the burned husks of British armor. 25 Cromwell tanks, 14 half-tracks, 20 carriers, all destroyed in 15 minutes by a single German Tiger, commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, the most feared tank ace in Europe. The mathematics of defeat were simple and brutal. The standard British 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at any practical range. The American Sherman, backbone of Allied armor, was equally helpless. British tankers had a phrase for engaging Tigers in standard Shermans. 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, 4 to die drawing its attention, while the 5th gets a side shot. But hidden among the wreckage that June morning, camouflaged to look like an ordinary Sherman, was something different, something the Germans didn't know existed. A tank that could kill a Tiger from the front at 1,000 yards. The British called it the Sherman Firefly. The Germans called it the death of their armored supremacy. The story began 2 years earlier, in the North African desert, where British tankers first learned what helplessness meant. May 27, 1942, Gazala, Libya. The sun was already merciless at dawn when Lieutenant Thomas Grimshaw of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment watched German panzers emerge from the heat shimmer like prehistoric monsters. His Crusader tank, fast and nimble, carried a 2-pounder gun that had seemed adequate against Italian armor. Against the new German Tiger I, with its 88mm gun and 100mm frontal armor, it was a pop gun. Grimshaw's gunner, Trooper James Cartwright, fired first. Perfect hit. The armor-piercing round struck the Tiger's glacis plate and ricocheted skyward, leaving barely a scratch. The Tiger's turret transversed with mechanical precision. 1 shot. Grimshaw's Crusader exploded. Its thin armor penetrated as easily as paper. Grimshaw survived, with burns covering 40% of his body. Cartwright didn't make it out. In the field hospitals, burned tankers told the same story. The German heavy tanks were invulnerable. British guns couldn't hurt them. American Shermans, arriving in increasing numbers under Lend-Lease, fared no better. The 75mm gun that equipped standard Shermans could barely scratch a Tiger's paint at combat ranges. The British had one weapon that could kill Tigers: the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a massive 76.2mm weapon that fired a 17-pound armor-piercing shot at nearly 3,000 feet per second. In defensive positions, properly concealed, it was devastating. German tankers had learned to fear its distinctive crack. But the 17-pounder was a towed weapon, vulnerable, immobile, impossible to use in mobile warfare. Major George Witheridge of the Tank Development Department had a radical idea: put the 17-pounder in a Sherman. His superiors thought he was insane. The 17-pounder was enormous. Its breech alone was too large to fit inside a Sherman's turret. The recoil forces would tear a Sherman's turret ring apart. The gun was too long, too heavy, too powerful for a medium tank platform. It cannot be done, the ordnance experts told Witheridge. The physics are impossible. Witheridge assembled a team anyway. W.G.K. Kilbourne, a civilian engineer, Lieutenant Colonel George Brighty, a tank designer who'd been trying to solve the same problem independently. Together, working in a workshop at Woolwich Arsenal in late 1943, They attempted the impossible.
They rotated the gun on its side, fitting the massive breech at an angle. They removed the hull machine gunner, using that space for ammunition storage. They cut away the interior of the turret, leaving barely inches of clearance. They shortened the recoil mechanism, designed new ammunition racks, modified the turret bustle. The prototype looked like a mechanical abortion. The gun barrel protruded so far forward that crews joked you could use it to knock on French farmhouse doors. The turret was cramped beyond reason, a claustrophobic steel coffin where men worked bent over in permanent discomfort. On September 6, 1943, they fired it for the first time. The Sherman's suspension groaned. The turret ring held. The armor-piercing, discarding sabot round punched through a Tiger's frontal armor plate at 1,000 yards like it was tissue paper. Witheridge had done the impossible. But convincing the British Army to accept his creation would prove almost as difficult as building it. The Firefly faced resistance from every direction. American commanders, embarrassed that the British had modified their tank, initially refused to allow production. American armor doctrine emphasized mobility and numbers over firepower. The idea of a defensive, long-range tank killer violated their tactical philosophy. British tank commanders weren't much more enthusiastic. The Firefly was ugly, ungainly, top-heavy. The long barrel made it difficult to maneuver in close terrain. The lack of a hull machine gun reduced close infantry defense. Most damning, it looked different from standard Shermans, making it an obvious priority target for German gunners. "It's a death trap," one British colonel declared. "The Germans will spot it immediately and concentrate all fire on it." But the men who would actually crew the tanks, the sergeants and lieutenants who'd watched their friends burn in undergunned Crusaders and Shermans, saw something different. They saw a chance to fight back, a chance to survive. Sergeant Joe Eakins of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry first saw a Firefly in March 1944 at a training depot in Yorkshire. After 2 years commanding a standard Sherman in Italy, watching German Panthers kill his squadron mates with impunity, the Firefly seemed salvation. "I looked at that gun," Eakins recalled years later, "and I thought, finally, we can hurt them back." The first Fireflies arrived in Normandy days after D-Day. By British doctrine, each 4-tank troop received 1 Firefly, with 3 standard 75mm Shermans. The Firefly was to hang back, providing overwatch and tank-killing capability, while the 75mm Shermans engaged softer targets. Firefly crews were ordered to disguise their tanks. They painted the long barrel with counter-shading to make it appear shorter. They welded false muzzle brakes partway down the barrel. They avoided silhouetting their distinctive profiles, anything to avoid standing out. Because British intelligence had learned something terrifying. German tank commanders had orders to kill Fireflies first, before all other targets. The Germans had encountered Fireflies in early skirmishes and immediately recognized the threat. For the first time since Tigers entered service, German tankers faced an Allied tank that could kill them frontally. The psychological impact was profound. German armor tactics, built around frontal invulnerability, suddenly had to account for Allied tanks that could hurt them. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer company in Normandy, recorded his first Firefly encounter in his diary on June 19, 1944. Engaged British armor column at 1,200 meters, destroyed lead tank identified as Sherman.
Second tank returned fire. Shell passed through Unterofficer Brown's Panther like a bolt from God. Frontal penetration. All crew killed instantly. This was no 75mm. Intelligence confirms British have upgunned Shermans. All units ordered. Kill the long-barreled Shermans first.
August 8, 1944. The village of Saint-Jean-de-Cremenel, south of Caen. This was the day the Firefly earned its legend. Operation Totalize, the massive Canadian and British push toward Falaise, was grinding into its second day. German defenses, anchored by Tiger tanks of the 101st Heavy Panzer Battalion, were exacting a terrible price. The flat Norman fields offered no cover. Tigers positioned on high ground could engage at ranges where Allied armor was helpless. Among the defenders was SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, the most successful tank ace in history, with 138 confirmed kills. His Tiger, number 007, had terrorized Allied armor since Villers-Bocage. To Allied tankers, Wittmann was death itself, a ghost in steel who struck without warning and vanished before retaliation. On that August morning, Wittmann commanded a group of 7 Tigers positioned to ambush the Canadian advance. Sergeant Joe Eakins, commanding Firefly No. 3 in A Squadron, 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, was advancing with the Canadian infantry when his gunner, Trooper John Boardman, spotted movement at extreme range. Tiger, 1,200 yards, 3 o'clock. Eakins traversed the turret. Through the gun sight, he could see the Tiger's hull-down position, only its turret and gun visible over the ridgeline. A near impossible shot with any Allied tank except one. Sabot loaded. The armor-piercing, discarding Sabot round was British ingenuity at its finest. A tungsten core, smaller than the gun barrel, encased in a lightweight aluminum sabot that fell away after leaving the muzzle. The result? A subcaliber penetrator traveling at over 3,000 feet per second with extraordinary accuracy and penetration. Eakins ranged the target. 1,200 yards, side wind minimal. Target stationary. Fire. The 17-pounder's recoil rocked the Sherman. Through the smoke, Eakins saw the impossible. The Tiger, Wittmann's Tiger, exploded. Catastrophic ammunition detonation. The turret lifted 10 feet in the air before crashing back down. Flames consumed the hull in seconds. Wittmann, the terror of Allied armor, was dead before he knew he'd been hit. Eakins' gunner had already acquired a second target, another Tiger, 1,000 yards, attempting to relocate. Fire. Direct hit. Penetration. The second Tiger brewed up, smoke pouring from its hatches. A third Tiger, panicked, exposed its flank, attempting to withdraw. Fire. 3 Tigers in less than 5 minutes. 3 kills at ranges where standard Shermans couldn't even damage the paint. The mathematical equation had changed. The invulnerable had become vulnerable. News of Eakins' actions spread through Allied armored units like electricity. The Firefly, initially mocked and resisted, suddenly became the most sought-after posting in the Royal Armored Corps. Tank crews volunteered for Firefly duty despite knowing it made them priority targets. The German response was immediate and desperate. Oberst Hans von Luck, whose Panzer regiment faced Fireflies throughout the Normandy campaign, later wrote, "We learned to identify them instantly. The long gun barrel, impossible to disguise despite their efforts. We would hold fire on 3 standard Shermans to get 1 clear shot at a Firefly. That gun changed everything.
For the first time, we couldn't rely on frontal armor. We had to fight like they did, with maneuver and stealth. German tank tactics, refined over 3 years of warfare, had to be completely revised. The doctrine of frontal assault, supported by superior armor and firepower, became suicide. Tigers and Panthers that had previously advanced with impunity now had to use cover, had to worry about flanks, had to treat Allied armor as a genuine threat. The Firefly's impact went beyond mechanical capability. It was psychological warfare. German tank crews, accustomed to armored superiority, now fought with doubt. Every Sherman might be a Firefly. Every engagement might be their last. Lieutenant Walter Schoening, Tiger commander with the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, survived the war to describe the fear. You would engage a Sherman column, confident. Then one would fire back, and the round would punch through your frontal armor. Your world would end in that instant. We lost 11 Tigers to Fireflies in 2 weeks. 11. These were tanks that had survived dozens of battles against Russian T-34s, against American Shermans, against everything the Allies could field. Then these upgunned Shermans appeared, and we died. The numbers tell the story. In August 1944 alone, Fireflies accounted for approximately 40% of German tank kills, despite representing only 25% of British Sherman strength. The kill-to-loss ratio was remarkable. For every Firefly destroyed, British crews claimed an average of 4.3 German tanks. But the Firefly's crew paid a terrible price for their effectiveness. Trooper William Savage, gunner in a Firefly of the 2nd Fife and 4th for Yeomanry, survived his tank being knocked out 3 times. The Germans knew what we were, he recalled. Every ambush, every defensive position, they looked for the Firefly first. When we advanced, we hung back, tried to blend in. Didn't always work. The gun barrel gave us away. Spotters would call it in. Then every German tank, every anti-tank gun, every Panzerfaust would target us first. The cramped interior made crew survival difficult. With no hull gunner, the crew was reduced to 4: commander, gunner, loader, driver. In combat, the commander and gunner worked in constant contortion, bent sideways to avoid the recoiling breech. Fatigue was relentless. Headaches from the cramped position were universal. When hit, the chances of all crew escaping were slim. The 17-pounder's ammunition was also problematic. The rounds were heavy, awkward, difficult to handle in the confined space. A good loader could fire 6 aimed shots per minute. A 75mm Sherman could fire 15. In a close engagement, rate of fire mattered as much as penetration. Yet, Firefly crews developed an almost mystical pride in their machines. They named them with defiance and dark humor: Achilles, Salamander, Death Dealer, Widowmaker. Names that reflected their role. Tank killers in a war where killing German armor was the highest art. September 17, 1944. Operation Martingarten, the disastrous Allied attempt to capture bridges across the Rhine. While British paratroopers were being destroyed at Arnhem, Fireflies of the 2nd Armored Division, Irish Guards, were fighting a desperate action against German armor trying to cut the narrow corridor to Nijmegen. Sergeant John Gorman, commanding a Firefly in the 2nd Armored Battalion, Irish Guards, found himself facing 4 Panther tanks at the crossroads near Valkensvaart. The tactical situation was impossible. Panthers at 800 yards in good defensive positions, supporting infantry, anti-tank guns covering the flanks. Doctrine said, withdraw, call for artillery, wait for support. Gorman attacked. We couldn't wait, he explained decades later. The airborne boys were dying. Every hour mattered, so we went in. His Firefly killed the first Panther from the front at 700 yards. The second Panther fired back, hitting Gorman's tank in the turret. The shell penetrated, but by grace or physics miracle, didn't detonate. The armor-piercing round passed completely through the turret above the ammunition storage, exiting through the rear plate. Gorman's gunner, Trooper Patrick Kelly, ignored the gaping hole where the shell had entered and fired again. The second Panther exploded. The remaining Panthers withdrew. Gorman's Firefly, with a hole through its turret large enough to fit a man's head, drove another 12 miles before the crew finally reported the damage. The Firefly's legend grew with each action. By winter 1944, as the Allies pushed into Germany itself, Firefly crews were veterans of a specialized, brutal trade. They'd learned to exploit the gun's range, engaging at distances where German return fire was ineffective. They'd mastered the art of ambush, positioning where the long barrel could be concealed until the critical moment. Most importantly, they'd learned to survive being the priority target. "You learn to move after every shot," explained Sergeant Thomas Newton of the 13th 18th Royal Hussars. "Fire and relocate, never stay static. The Germans would plaster your last position with everything they had: artillery, mortars, tank fire. So you'd shoot, reverse, reposition. Shoot, reverse, reposition." Exhausting, terrifying, but it kept you alive. The Polish 1st Armored Division, fighting under British command, received Fireflies in August 1944 and used them with particular ruthlessness. Polish crews, many of whom had lost family to German occupation, treated Firefly duty as personal vendetta. Corporal Józef Kozłowski, gunner in a Polish Firefly, described his motivation simply: "Every Tiger I killed was for Warsaw. Every Panther was for my sister, taken by Germans in 1939. I never saw her again. The Firefly gave me a way to hurt them back, to make them feel what we felt: helpless, outmatched, afraid." The Germans tried everything to counter the Firefly threat. They developed new tactics, better camouflage, ambush doctrines specifically designed to isolate and destroy the long-barrel Shermans. They modified their tanks, adding side skirts, improvised armor, anything to defeat the 17-pounder's penetration. Nothing worked. The simple mathematical reality was that the Firefly could kill any German tank from ranges where German tanks couldn't reliably kill it back. The 88mm gun on the Tiger I, fearsome against standard Shermans, found the Firefly's frontal armor more resistant than expected. The Sherman's basic design, with its sloped frontal armor and compact turret, was better protected than its reputation suggested. More crucially, Firefly crews fought with the desperation of men who knew they were priority targets. They didn't trade shots. They killed first or died. By December 1944, German tank commanders admitted what statistics confirmed. The Firefly was the most dangerous Allied tank, more feared than the heavier Russian IS-2, more respected than even the new American Pershing. General Major Heinz Guderian, in a report to Hitler dated December 15, 1944, wrote with unusual candor, "The British upgunned Sherman represents a fundamental shift in armored combat capability. Our tactical and technological advantages in tank warfare have been negated. Officers report that crews now fear Allied armor in a manner not seen since 1942. Morale implications are severe. Hitler's response was typical. The report was dismissed as defeatist. Orders were issued to prioritize Fireflies, as if German gunners weren't already trying. New super heavy tanks were promised, tanks that would restore German superiority. They never arrived in meaningful numbers. The Firefly, ugly and improvised, remained on the battlefield in ever-increasing numbers through the war's final months. March 24, 1945, the Rhine crossing at Wesel, the last great river barrier defending Germany itself. Fireflies of the Coldstream Guards supported the assault, engaging German strongpoints from the western bank while infantry crossed in amphibious vehicles. Sergeant Thomas Evans, commanding Firefly No. 6, engaged German pillboxes with high explosive rounds, then switched to armor-piercing rounds when a camouflaged Jagdpanther tank destroyer revealed itself at 1,400 yards. One shot, direct hit. The Jagdpanther's slope frontal armor, proof against most Allied weapons, was pierced cleanly by the 17-pounder Sabot round. The massive tank destroyer burned on the eastern bank, a monument to British desperation transformed into engineering triumph. April 1945. The war in Europe entered its final weeks. German resistance collapsed under relentless pressure. But even in defeat, German tankers maintained professional respect for the weapon that had broken their armored supremacy. Oberst Barkmann, of Panzerlehr Division, surrendering to British forces near Bremen, asked to see a Firefly. British tank crews, wary of a trick, eventually allowed him to approach one of their tanks. Barkmann circled it slowly, studying the gun, the modified turret, the obvious improvisation of the design. Finally, he spoke through an interpreter. "We heard about these before we saw them. Nobody believed they existed. An American tank with a gun that could kill Tigers from the front? Impossible. Then we faced them." He paused, touching the long barrel with something approaching reverence. "This gun ended the war. Not the bombs, not the Russians, not the invasion. This gun. Because it meant we could no longer win tank battles by frontal assault. It meant our armor advantage meant nothing. It meant every engagement became uncertain." He stepped back, saluted the British crew with formal military precision, and walked away to captivity. The statistics of the Firefly's service tell a story of desperate effectiveness. Between D-Day and VE Day, approximately 2,200 Fireflies served in Northwest Europe. They accounted for an estimated 500 to 600 German tanks destroyed, including dozens of Tigers and over 100 Panthers. The loss rate was high, nearly 50% by war's end, testament to being the priority target in every engagement.
But the loss rate of standard Shermans facing German heavy armor without Firefly support was worse, much worse. One final story from the last days of the war captures the Firefly's legacy. April 28, 1945, a small town in northern Germany whose name nobody remembers. A mixed unit of Hitler Youth, SS remnants, and regular Wehrmacht holdouts had barricaded the main street with a hastily concealed Panther tank. A squadron of 11th Armored Division approached cautiously, knowing these final pockets of resistance could be as deadly as anything faced in Normandy. The leading Sherman, a standard 75mm, rounded a corner and was immediately hit. The crew bailed out as flames consumed their tank. Sergeant William Foster, commanding the squadron's Firefly, had been expecting this. The same pattern had repeated dozens of times in the past year. German armor in ambush, standard Shermans dying, the Firefly coming forward to finish the job. Foster's gunner, Trooper Richard Hammond, age 19, who joined the crew just 2 months earlier, acquired the Panther through his gun sight. Perfect side shot at 400 yards,
an easy kill for the 17-pounder. "Say about loaded," Hammond reported, voice steady, despite this being only his third combat engagement. "Hold," Foster ordered. Through his commander's periscope, he could see German soldiers in the buildings flanking the Panther. Teenagers in oversized uniforms, old men with Panzerfausts they barely knew how to use, fighting because surrender meant disgrace in the madness that was Nazi Germany's final days. The war was already over. Everyone knew it. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was in his bunker. These Germans in this forgotten town were already defeated. They just didn't know it yet. "Open fire," Foster ordered. The 17-pounder spoke once. The Panther's turret blew 20 feet in the air. The German soldiers, seeing their armored protection destroyed in one shot, dropped their weapons and emerged with raised hands. Foster's Firefly never fired another shot in anger. 3 days later, Germany surrendered. The Firefly had fulfilled its desperate purpose. Created from necessity, mocked at birth, it had become the weapon that broke German armored supremacy and gave Allied tankers a fighting chance. After the war, military analysts studied the Firefly's impact. American ordnance officers who had initially opposed the modification quietly incorporated its lessons into post-war tank designs. The M26 Pershing, arriving too late to matter in Europe, carried a 90mm gun directly influenced by British recognition that anti-tank capability mattered more than mobility or doctrine.
The Firefly itself was quickly retired. By 1946, most were scrapped. A few survived as range targets or training vehicles. The few that remain today sit in museums, their long barrels still pointing forward, ready for battles that will never come. But the men who crewed them never forgot. Joe Eakins, the sergeant who killed Whitman, lived until 2012. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he talked about the Firefly with the quiet respect of a man who owed his life to a machine that should never have worked. "It was ugly," he said in one of his last interviews. "Cramped, uncomfortable, dangerous. Every German on the battlefield wanted to kill us first. But that gun, that beautiful gun, for the first time we weren't helpless. For the first time we could fight back on equal terms, more than equal. That gun made us the hunters instead of the hunted." Thomas Grimshaw, the lieutenant who'd watched his Crusader crew die in North Africa, survived his burns and rejoined his unit in late 1943. He was assigned to command a Firefly in Normandy. He named it Cartwright, after his gunner who hadn't made it out of the burning Crusader. "Every time we killed a Tiger," Grimshaw recalled, "I thought about James, about all the boys who died because our guns couldn't hurt German armor. The Firefly couldn't bring them back, but it could make sure their deaths weren't meaningless. It could make sure we finished the job." The Firefly entered service too late to save the thousands of Allied tankers who died in undergunned Crusaders and standard Shermans. But for those who survived long enough to crew one, for those who felt the power of the 17-pounder's recoil and watched German heavy armor burn from ranges previously impossible, the Firefly was more than a machine. It was redemption. It was justice delivered in tungsten and explosive. It was the weapon that turned helpless victims into deadly hunters. And it was proof that sometimes desperation and improvisation and sheer bloody-minded determination to fight back could create something that changed the course of a war. The Germans laughed at the upgunned Sherman with its impossibly long barrel and awkward appearance. They stopped laughing when that barrel spoke. They stopped laughing when their invincible Tigers burned. They stopped laughing when the mathematics of armored warfare shifted beneath their feet. The Sherman Firefly was never the best tank in World War II by conventional measures. It wasn't the fastest, the best armored, the most reliable, or the most comfortable. But it was the tank the German armor feared most. And in the brutal calculus of tank warfare, fear and killing power matter more than any other specification.
The story of the Sherman Firefly is the story of necessity forcing innovation, of men refusing to accept helplessness, of engineers doing the impossible because the alternative was unthinkable, of crews volunteering for the most dangerous duty in armored warfare because somebody had to carry the gun that could kill tigers. It's the story of how the tank Hitler's generals dismissed became the weapon that shattered German armored supremacy and helped end the war. And it's a reminder that sometimes the greatest weapons are born not in planned development programs or strategic doctrine, but in workshops where desperate men refuse to accept defeat. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the crews who climbed into those cramped turrets knowing they were priority targets, if it made you understand the cold courage it took to face tigers with a gun that barely fit in your tank, then their legacy endures. The Firefly crews didn't fight for glory or fame. They fought because they had the gun that could make a difference. And they paid the price, death by priority targeting, so that others might survive. Subscribe and help us keep their legacy alive. Help us remember the names time tried to erase. Help us honor the improvised weapon that helped win a war and the men who made it legendary.